Picture this. September 6th, 1566. Inside a thick silk tent somewhere in Hungary, a royal physician presses a knife into the stomach of the most powerful man alive. This is not surgery meant to save a life. This is damage control. Suleiman the Magnificent is already dead. His body is rotting fast. Outside the tent, nearly 100,000 Ottoman soldiers wait, laugh, sing, and cheer, fully convinced their sultan is still alive and commanding the war. Inside, doctors work in panic, removing Suleiman's heart and intestines and burying them beneath the tent floor, desperate to hide the smell of death. An entire army is fighting for a corpse. Just a few miles away, inside a burning fortress, another old man prepares for death in a very different way. Nikola Šubić Zrinski isn't hiding his fate. He's dressing for it. He slips into his finest silk robe. He places a diamond-studded hat on his head. Then he does something strange. He takes 100 gold ducats and sews them into the lining of his coat. He tells his men that whoever kills him deserves to be paid for the effort. He refuses to be a poor corpse. Two aging commanders, one wrapped in lies and spices, the other wrapped in gold and defiance. Before we can understand how their final pact ends, we have to understand why it ever began. But before we dive into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider liking the video and subscribing for more long-form content like this. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It still amazes me that we're exploring stories from the 16th century together, connected across continents by curiosity. Now let's talk about Vienna. For 46 years, Suleiman had expanded the Ottoman Empire across 3 continents: Baghdad, Belgrade, Budapest. Yet Europe's greatest prize remained just out of reach. Vienna, the golden apple. Suleiman was 72 years old now. His legs were swollen with gout, so painful he could no longer ride a horse. Servants carried him across the rough Hungarian terrain in a covered litter. This was not a young man's campaign. It was an old man's final vanity project. He wanted to die a conqueror. To reach Vienna, the Ottoman army needed a clear path through Hungary. And sitting directly in the way was a small, swampy fortress called Szigetvar. Suleiman expected it to fall within days. On paper, that assumption made sense. Marching beneath Ottoman banners were nearly 100,000 soldiers, supported by 300 cannons and an enormous logistics train of camels, wagons, and supplies. Facing them was a garrison that barely registered on a map. Nikola Šubić Zrinski commanded just 2,300 men, mostly Croatian and Hungarian infantry, supported by a small cavalry force. No reinforcements were coming. Emperor Maximilian II had a massive army nearby, but he refused to move. His strategy was simple and cold. Let Szigetvar burn to buy time. Zrinski knew he had been abandoned. When the Ottoman vanguard arrived on August 5th, the ground itself seemed to tremble. The visual impact alone often broke defenders before the first shot was fired. Endless rows of tents stretched to the horizon like fresh snowfall. War drums thundered, muskets clattered, calls to prayer echoed across the marshes. Suleiman sent a messenger to the gates with a standard offer: surrender, and Zrinski would rule Croatia as a wealthy Ottoman vassal. Refuse and die. Most rational men would have taken the deal. Zrinski answered with cannon fire. He didn't just reject the offer, he insulted the Sultan's generosity. That moment turned a minor obstacle into a personal vendetta. Furious and in constant pain, Suleiman ordered an immediate assault. He expected his elite janissaries to swarm the walls and end the nuisance before nightfall. He had no idea he'd walked into a meat grinder. By 1566, Suleiman was no longer the unstoppable conqueror Europe remembered. He was old, sick, and physically broken. His reign had lasted longer than any sultan before him, and his banners had flown from Baghdad to Budapest. He had crushed Hungary at Mohacs. He had once stood before Vienna itself in 1529, only to be turned back by weather and walls. That failure haunted him. His body was failing, but his ambition was not. Hidden behind curtains, cheeks painted with rouge to fake vitality, he launched one last campaign to prove he was still the Padishah of the world. Standing in his way was a man cut from the same hardened leather. Nikola Šubić Zrinski was 58 years old, a Croatian nobleman and veteran of decades of border warfare. He wasn't a king, but in these lands, his authority bordered on legend. He knew Ottoman tactics, their language, and their brutality. He specialized in asymmetric warfare, raiding supply lines and vanishing into forests. Years earlier, Zrinski had personally offended Suleiman by refusing to pay tribute and defeating a local Ottoman governor. To the Sultan, this wasn't just rebellion, it was insubordination. Suleiman never forgot a slight. When the Ottoman army turned toward Szigetvar, the move was strategic, but it was also personal. The sheer size of the force was meant to paralyze resistance. Contemporary chroniclers described the camp as a moving city, miles of tents laid out with geometric precision, artillery specially cast to shatter stone walls. Yet this empire-level force had stopped to swat a fly. Inside the fortress, Zrinski had stockpiled food and powder, expecting a long siege. He had written repeatedly to Emperor Maximilian II, who sat nearby with 80,000 troops capable of challenging Suleiman directly. The emperor never replied. Zrinski gathered his officers and offered no false hope. He swore an oath that he would never abandon them, never surrender, and would share every hardship. In return, he demanded their lives. They accepted. The gates were barred, the bridges razed. On one side stood an empire at its peak, led by a dying monarch, desperate for one last victory. On the other stood a doomed garrison, led by a man who preferred death to submission. Suleiman pitched his tent on a nearby hill and issued a simple order: take the fortress, bring back Zrinski's head, and clear the road to Vienna. The bombardment began the next morning, and this is where geography entered the story as the silent dictator of war. Szigetvar was not a proud stone keep on a hill. It was a swamp rat's fortress. Built low in marshland, it sat on 3 separate islands connected by narrow bridges. To take it, the Ottomans would have to fight the same siege 3 times. First the new town, then the old town, then the citadel. Surrounded by stagnant water, cavalry was useless. Siege tunnels flooded almost instantly. Heavy towers sank into the mud. Every advantage of numbers collapsed inside a choke point. Zrinski's marksmen turned the marsh into a kill zone. Ottoman engineers tried to drain the water, digging ditches under constant fire. Zrinski launched lightning raids, slaughtering laborers and vanishing before the janissaries could respond. This was siege warfare in the 16th century. Less swordplay, more shovels. By August 19th, the moat around the new town had begun to dry. Suleiman grew impatient. He was tired of digging. He ordered the assault. The war drums thundered. The horns screamed. The engineering phase was over. The slaughter was about to begin. At dawn on August 19th, the silence of the marshlands shattered. Ottoman war drums rolled across the swamp, deep and relentless. joined by the shrill cry of Zurna horns. This was the sound Europe had feared for a century. It meant the digging was over. Now came the men. Leading the charge were the Janissaries. These were not conscripted peasants. They were the Sultan's shock troops, the first standing army in Europe since Rome. Taken as Christian boys, converted, trained relentlessly, and bound by loyalty to the throne alone. They advanced without panic, without shouting, climbing over fallen comrades as if they were obstacles, not bodies. The wooden palisades of the new town had already been shattered by artillery. Through the breaches, the Janissaries surged forward like floodwater. Zrinski's defenders met them with a wall of lead. Muskets fired at point-blank range. White felt caps dropped by the dozens. But for every Janissary who fell, more took his place. Numbers began to overwhelm discipline. The new town became a maze of street fighting, blades dulling as arms hacked at iron and bone. Zrinski fought at the front, sword in hand, until he recognized the moment no commander wants to face. Staying meant extinction. He ordered the retreat. This was the most dangerous maneuver of the entire siege. To escape, his men had to disengage from hand-to-hand combat, turn their backs on the enemy, and sprint across a narrow bridge under fire. Panic rippled through the ranks. Men shoved and trampled one another as Ottoman arrows rained down, slicking the planks with blood. Zrinski stood at the gate of the old town, physically dragging men inside, shouting orders, holding the line with sheer force of will. The Janissaries were only steps behind when the last defenders crossed. Then the gates slammed shut. A torch was thrown. Zrinski had ordered his engineers to lace the abandoned new town with powder and pitch. The resulting explosion turned the district into an inferno. Wooden houses ignited instantly, creating a wall of heat so intense the pursuing Janissaries were forced back, shielding their faces. The fire bought time. It also destroyed everything the Ottomans hoped to capture. From the walls of the old town, the survivors watched their former homes burn. The buffer was gone. The Ottomans dragged their cannons forward, setting them up on ground that had just been defended hours earlier. The range was now point blank. The bombardment became a rhythmic earthquake. Every impact shook the swampy ground so violently that men were knocked off the ramparts without being touched. The masonry began to crumble. Inside the walls, a new enemy emerged: decay. The summer heat turned the air into a poisonous soup. Corpses bloated in the no-man's land. Wells dried or turned brackish. Men fought with cracked lips and swollen tongues. Suleiman no longer needed to storm the walls. Time was doing the work for him. Morale cracked. One lieutenant, driven mad by exhaustion, suggested opening negotiations. Zrinski did not argue. He had the man seized and beheaded in the town square. Holding the severed head aloft, he made a promise, not a threat. There would be no surrender. The grumbling stopped. By early September, the old town was a shell. Breaches gaped in the walls. Zrinski had fewer than 1,000 men left capable of fighting. On the night of September 5th, under cover of darkness, he ordered the second retreat. They crossed the final bridge into the citadel. 800 survivors crowded into the stone keep alongside women, children, and the wounded. When the bridge rose behind them, the Ottomans swarmed into the abandoned town, cheering. They thought the battle was over. They had just cornered something far more dangerous. History delivered its cruelest irony on the night of September 6th. While Zrinski sharpened his sword for a final stand against Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan himself lay dead. Inside the imperial tent, Suleiman's heart had simply stopped. No battlefield glory, No final command, just silence. If the army learned the truth, the siege would collapse instantly. Ottoman tradition demanded soldiers abandon the field to secure succession. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha understood the disaster in seconds, so he decided Suleiman was not dead. Not yet. The physicians were ordered to remove the Sultan's organs and bury them beneath the tent floor. The body was washed, wrapped in musk-scented cloth, and dressed in ceremonial robes. The doctors were sworn to silence under pain of death. Some accounts say they were executed immediately. For the next 48 hours, Sokolu ruled an empire through a corpse. He forged the Sultan's signature, issued orders, had meals delivered from the royal kitchen, ordered the band to play Suleiman's favorite marches. Outside the tent, messengers bowed to a silhouette they believed was alive. 100,000 men were now obeying a ghost. Inside the citadel, Zrinski had no idea. He saw Ottoman banners flying. He heard the drums beating for the final assault. In his mind, he was still fighting the shadow of God. A final letter arrived demanding surrender in Suleiman's name, promising mercy from a ruler who could no longer grant it. Zrinski answered with cannon fire. Dawn broke on September 7th over a landscape of total ruin. The citadel was barely standing. The moat was clogged with debris and bodies. Inside, the air reeked of sulfur and death. Sokolu made one last attempt to avoid the cost of an assault. An arrow carried a letter offering Zrinski hereditary rule of Croatia, gold for his men, and safe passage. Zrinski snapped the arrow and threw it into the fire. Honor in this world was worth more than life. But the most terrible decision was unfolding below the ramparts. In the cellars of the keep, the women knew what awaited them if the Ottomans broke through. Slavery, sale, erasure. According to surviving accounts, they begged not to be taken alive. Whether by fire, blade, or their own hands, history records only the smoke that followed. Zrinski ordered everything burned: robes, maps, heirlooms, letters. The citadel would leave nothing behind but ash. By mid-morning, the heat inside the keep was unbearable. Outside, the drums reached a fever pitch. Zrinski looked at the 600 men who remained. They had delayed an empire for 33 days. There were no walls left. It was time to attack. Inside the smoke-filled tower, Nikola Šubić Zrinski removed his battered armor. Not because the fighting was over, but because history was about to begin. He pulled on a clean silk robe, then a heavy velvet coat. On his head, he placed a hat adorned with crane feathers and a diamond brooch. Finally, he took a purse holding 100 gold ducats and carefully sewed it into the lining of his clothes. "I will not let the man who loots my body complain that he found nothing," he said. Even at the end, his pride was absolute. He took his father's saber, a heavy blade worn smooth by decades of border warfare, and walked into the courtyard. 600 men waited for him, soot-stained, bleeding, starving. They didn't need a speech. Zrinski pointed at the gate. The plan was simple: a suicide charge. They would not be smoked out like rats. They would die like wolves, tearing into the enemy's throat. Outside the citadel, Ottoman troops crowded the drawbridge, expecting surrender. Janissaries stood shoulder to shoulder, white caps packed tight, scimitars raised. Then the oak gates groaned open. No white flag appeared. Instead, the Ottomans found themselves staring down the barrel of a massive cannon placed directly in the gateway. It wasn't loaded with a single iron ball. It was packed with chains, nails, scrap metal, and broken iron. The fuse was lit. The explosion turned the cannon into a giant shotgun. The front ranks of the Janissaries were obliterated, bodies torn apart. The bridge instantly painted red. Smoke billowed outward. Through it, Zrinski charged, roaring, "Jesus! Jesus!" The 600 followed. For a few impossible minutes, shock alone pushed the Ottoman vanguard back. The defenders fought with the manic strength of men already dead. They weren't trying to survive. They were trying to take as many enemies with them as possible. But numbers always win. Janissary marksmen leveled their muskets at the man in the diamond hat. Zrinski was struck twice in the chest. An arrow pierced his head. He fell to one knee, still gripping his saber, then collapsed onto the blood-soaked planks of the bridge. When he fell, the end came quickly. The remaining defenders were overwhelmed and butchered where they stood. Janissaries hacked Zrinski's head from his body and mounted it on a pike, eager to present proof of victory. The citadel had fallen. The Ottomans surged inside, shouting triumph, trampling corpses as they rushed to claim their reward. They expected gold, silver, slaves, something to justify the month of hell. What they found were barrels, kegs stacked inside the powder magazine. As thousands of soldiers crowded into the ruins, looting and laughing, the spark reached the powder. Whether lit by a surviving woman hiding in the cellar or by a fuse Zrinski had set before his charge hardly mattered. The explosion was cataclysmic. The citadel seemed to inhale before erupting outward. Stone walls that had resisted weeks of bombardment were instantly turned into shrapnel. A mushroom cloud of smoke and debris punched into the sky. Nearly 3,000 of the Sultan's elite troops were annihilated in a heartbeat. Men were crushed under falling masonry. Others were incinerated where they stood. The blast knocked soldiers off their feet hundreds of yards away in the main camp. Zrinski's final act had turned his own fortress into a massive bomb. The survivors stood in stunned silence, coated in the dust of their comrades. Yes, the fortress had been taken, but it had taken them back. The numbers were devastating. Of the nearly 100,000 soldiers who marched from Istanbul, close to 30,000 were dead or incapacitated. The army had lost its best troops, its engineers, and its morale. And for what? A smoking ruin in a swamp. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha watched the cloud rise near the tent that still hid his dead sultan. He understood immediately. The campaign was over. Vienna would not be reached. Winter was coming. The army was broken. He ordered a retreat that would be disguised as victory. The Ottomans packed up and marched home, still pretending Suleiman lived, still pretending triumph. Only when they reached Belgrade did Sokolu finally announce the truth. Suleiman the Magnificent had been dead for weeks. The shock was immense, but the army was too exhausted, too far from home to revolt. Selim II ascended the throne, but the golden age of Ottoman expansion died in the mud of Szigetvar. They would not threaten Vienna again for more than a century. Zrinski's body was buried beneath the ruins he defended. His head, sent to the Habsburg camp, was eventually laid to rest in a monastery, honored as a relic of martyrdom. The siege lasted 33 days. Those 33 days pushed the Ottoman army into September. Rain turned roads to mud. Logistics collapsed. Because 2,300 men refused to quit, Europe's future changed. Cardinal Richelieu later called it the battle that saved civilization. It sounds dramatic, but the timeline supports it. Had Szigetvar fallen in 3 days, Suleiman would have reached Vienna before winter. History would look very different. So what does this story leave us with? Emperor Maximilian II survived by waiting. He kept his army intact and his crown secure, and today he's barely remembered. Zrinski died and became legend. This story asks an uncomfortable question. What is the value of a hopeless fight? Sometimes winning isn't standing over your enemy's corpse. Sometimes winning is buying time. Enough time for the rest of the world to wake up. At Szigetvar, a stubborn old man and a few thousand civilians derailed an empire's destiny. They lost the battle. They won the future. If you found this story compelling, consider liking the video to help share it with others. And let me know in the comments. Was Maximilian right to stay back and protect Vienna? Or should he have marched to save Zrinski?